What's up, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Yours Truly podcast. I'm your host, Christian Baxter, and today we have Cadell Last from the digital network Philosophy Portal returning with us here in the Yours Truly virtual studio. When I first spoke with Cadell Last, we were circling the edges of something: personal deconstruction, Christian atheism, the collapse of our shared world, and what comes after deconstruction when there's no map left but the one carved into our own chest. Then Cadell invited me into his space on Philosophy Portal. The roles flipped. We traced the implosion of Protestant identity, the strange survival of the faith inside of a meaning crisis, and the way online community is slowly rebuilding forms of belonging that feel older than the internet itself. And then a few weeks ago, he sat down with Tim Alladin on Voicecraft and opened an entirely new layer, a new metaphysics, new system transitions, new language for the future we're stumbling towards, whether we like it or not. Today, Cadell returns to Yours Truly to talk about his new book, New Speculations, and to tie these threads together: the personal, the cultural, the metaphysical, the spiritual. Where's the self going? Where is Christianity going? And where is meaning going? And what waits on the other side of the transition we're all living through? And as always, don't forget to like and subscribe for the channel influence. And if you'd like to support the channel, consider becoming a channel member here on YouTube. And if you're listening to the podcast, leave a review. It would go a long way. So let's get into it, practicing some conversation craft today with Cadell Last, Philosophy Portal. Hi, this is Christian Baxter, and you're listening to Yours Truly, a place we go to think out loud. And we're rolling. All right, Cadell, thank you. So I mentioned in the intro, you recently had a conversation on Voicecraft with Tim Alladin, and you were really unpacking some themes from your new book, Real Speculations, correct? Real Speculations? Okay. And I was just totally fascinated because you create this, it sounds like you create a trialectic or dialectic between Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, and Jordan Peterson. And I feel like one of the main things that really continues to pluck my attention and my interest in what I'm doing here is this thread of, we're kind of three or four digital generations down now from the Peterson phenomenon. It's hard to kind of, maybe I haven't done like a sociological mapping of this, but it kind of feels like this thing went out, and you framed this new atheism thing, and then all of this, it unlocked something in the social subconscious or the collective unconscious. It comes up and it's doing all these things. And I just had a conversation with P.F. Jung, who's a young guy doing content downstream from Jordan Peterson. And he's had conversations with like CJ the X, or I think whatever you call him, he's a non-binary. He got into Peterson, and it's like he has things that really helped him with things he's critiquing, and it's just so interesting to see not the initial bristling of the intensities that were initially surrounding him, but people that have now began to process him and things happen, and it seems like there's a part of that's a part of what you're doing and what you've noticed. And we've had conversations. You were on my channel, I was on your channel, and then I did a thing with your digital network community Philosophy Portal. So with all of that, what do you think is this question of the religious architecture, where the critique that you labeled was that something like Dawkins or Harris saw it as like a aesthetic garnish to liberalism, but didn't really take it as seriously in a sense as it should have been. And Peterson changed that. What's been happening since then?
So first off, I want to say two things. Well, first, great to be here. And thanks for taking an interest in that conversation with Tim, which I think Tim did a great job hosting that, and really appreciate him diving into real speculations to the depth that he did. When we go into this dialectic of Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Jordan Peterson, that's kind of the opening framing of real speculations. And I want to say sort of the theoretical, philosophical background of the way I'm thinking about this is both deeply inspired by Hegel's phenomenology of spirit, but it's also deeply inspired by my own journey, and just in terms of the salience of what I've been tracking since I became a young man, since I was 19. Richard Dawkins was a salient figure for me in my early 20s. Sam Harris was never a central figure for me, but he was someone I was always tracking. Like, I was always seeing him as kind of an important figure in the zeitgeist. And then when Jordan Peterson blew up in 2016, I mean, that was a whole phenomenon in which I was completely enraptured in an interesting way. And my contributions to the intellectual milieu around this time actually contributed to bringing forth the Peterson-Zizek debate, because that's all the way I was analyzing the Peterson phenomenon was always in the context of my interest in Zizekian philosophy. And I really was dying to see that debate between Peterson and Zizek and that whole phenomenon. I have an opinion on what happened there, but want to frame that as kind of the background of the opening of real speculations. And the connection with Hegel's phenomenology of spirit is that there's a dialectical structure in Hegel's phenomenology which runs through reason, spirit, religion, absolute knowing. And I really feel like I've strongman this argument. Like, I'm not making a straw man out of any of these figures. I claim Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Jordan Peterson. I'm taking them at their word. But Richard Dawkins is literally, for me, trying to use reason to get to absolute knowing without any mediation of spirit and religion. And I would take that to be his foundation. Like, his foundation was the foundation for science and reason. And in that sense, the way he views spirit, the way he views religion, is only as a kind of negative transcendental illusion, meaning we can just do away with them. All spiritual mumbo jumbo, religious dogmatism, spiritual obscurantism, religious authority. And so it's as if you can just use reason to get to absolute knowing in his view. The second,
what was kind of the crass called that premature ejaculation was
yes. Well, Hegel in the phenomenology of spirit, he's trying to develop a spirit science. And he's saying that a pure materialist science, in the way that the way someone like Richard Dawkins would think about science, he says it's like a shot from a shot from a pistol. Like, it's like having a pistol before it's like a child having a gun. It's like, so like for Hegel, it's like science is like a gun, like a very powerful weapon. And the scientist has to be, by spirit science, Hegel's interested in the spiritual disposition of the subject who is holding that gun.
Can I go in there? Because something along the lines that I've picked up from like John Vervaeke's work is that there's no view from nowhere. And that's what that reminds me of. And
absolutely.
That this new conversation about like theology, I guess, being in a sense important for the future. And, a lot of people will hear that and be, can take that a lot of different ways, but I think there's a way that it's framed where the science itself is not this ideal non-sectarian, non-impartial thing, that it's always attached to the doer. And so it sounds like the way you're interpreting Hegel there is that, and there's something along the lines of how science developed within the monasteries and the European milieu of it being connected deeply to spirit in a way. And that there's a question of now what that may need or should or could look like in the future.
Absolutely. And, Vervaeke's idea that there's no view from nowhere is absolutely one of the illusions, let's say, of a science that tries to, as it were, reach its proper standpoint, just discarding with spirit and religion. This might be why Vervaeke is saying that the science of the future is related to theology, in the sense that we need to take on board religion, like scientifically. We need to take on board theology scientifically. We can't just see it as we can't only do it through the lens of deconstruction. And the other thing that I always thought was a missed opportunity for the evolutionary types, like a materialist evolutionary type, is just to think about the material evolution of religion as non-arbitrary. Like, and what would it mean, like, if like the material evolution was arbitrary? Like, that would be like, you would have to presuppose that all human beings throughout history are like retarded or something, or like just, or you know what I mean? Like the fact that we went to war over simple minor religious distinctions for centuries and organized our entire civilization and societies around religion, it must have an evolutionary relevance from an evolutionary point. Like, if you're thinking from an evolutionary point of view, and there are people who have written about this now. So that's not I'm not saying that there's no literature on that. I think that's important.
And from a more popular perspective, I think Brett Weinstein has kind of picked that up.
Yeah.
I tacitly follow him on like X and their journey. And even just to
I
that
follow him
point,
as well.
He was using such religious, him and his wife, Heather Hang, were using such religious language related to this new ad about kind of the digital avatar of the grandmother. I don't know if you saw that there's a company that's creating an app that you can download your grandma into, and then like your grandkid can have that grandma talking to you when you're, and they were he called it like an abomination or desecration. She was using words like, they were using these religious words to define what they were looking at related to, and Heather's point, and this just was a little clip, like a little short for their episode, but it was like, this is taking away our ability to grieve, which again is a spiritual, I mean, obviously, these words are psychological, but a spiritual practice, for millennia. And to that point.
Absolutely. I mean, I would say that, yeah, there's kind of like a spontaneous recoil that I felt in myself when you mentioned the digital avatar of the grandmother. And I have the same recoil, for example, when I listen to someone like Ray Kurzweil, the technologist singletarian, talk about how he's trying to dedicate his life in order to resurrect his father using all of these historical documents that he's collected in his basement for decades in order to create a virtual avatar in an app of his father so he can talk to his father. There's something wrong there. And I think that it's related to the process of grief. It's related to the process of loss. That the subject, actually, back to the importance of the subject, that the subject is something that is capable of losing. And I think that there's something in this virtual immortal preservation, which is trying to create a superficial win and a defense against this horrible loss that you don't want to process, and that you'd need something like a religious experience to process that loss.
And that goes back to this, your work and relationship with Peter Rollins on lack, right? I mean, that's
absolutely
what brings me to thinking about like grief, lack, loss,
yes.
Suffering, this so relationship.
That's the idea. The idea is the subject is most intimately related to lack. And because of that, we can lose anything. So any positive content that you identify with the subject can in principle lose it because the subject is lacking, but for Peter Rollins, this is seen as a positive thing. And that's a kind of weird Hegelian logic. And it is connected to something I wanted to talk to you about Protestantism and Calvinism. That might be getting ahead of ourselves a little bit.
That's okay. We can try.
Well, this notion I told you before we started recording, I was listening to this conversation with Benjamin Boyce and Nick Land, where Nick Land is currently fascinated with this notion in Calvinism of total depravity. And he says total depravity is at the center of Calvinism and center of Protestant ethic, and that it enables a certain kind of social system which he's interested in. But I was connecting that to Rollins' pyrotheology, and that total depravity could actually be connected to what we call subjective destitution and lack, which I think Peter Rollins' work, the way I track it, is that it's in something that I see as a continuity with the Protestant tradition.
Right. I mean, that, in my hearing Luke Thompson, another figure in this kind of my corner of the internet orbit, is that the conversation that related to Protestantism, other figures like Rob Bell, which Peter was kind of coming up during that time. And there is this radical, these other terms like priesthood of the believer, like hyper individualism related to a faith, that comes down to, you don't have a mediator on earth necessarily, even though these patterns still, you have a preacher or a pastor, you have, there's always a level of mediation that we're elder or, mentor, all these types, discipleship. There's always certain levels of mediation, but against the background of medieval Catholicism, selling indulgences, that being, you have to pay for your mediation in that kind of way. There was a large critique, but I'm not a theologian, so I don't know the history related to the difference between, or how original sin was interpreted between figures like Calvin and Luther and the Catholic magisterium. But I know that even figures like Augustine kind of dealt with this idea as well, because coming out of, well, this was another part of the conversation with Tim that I was curious about, because in this kind of meta conversation of the what's next, what are we going through to, there begs the question, can humanity transcend itself, or is humanity qua humanity? And there's always a certain level, whether it's total or a more of a general sense, a depravity problem that we're always going to be stuck with. And for the individual, as history and as time went on, it seems like we begin to wrestle with that on an individual level and a societal level. And, you were talking about that in relationship to human rights in the journey with individualism, that the Protestant project has taken these, I think I could probably be in good company in saying that trying to distill Calvin into his what's called tulip, the 5 points or 7 points of Calvinism, is probably not the best way, but that it's been mimetic, and at least in the last, for the younger folks, myself included, as I started looking at that stuff even in high school. But in relationship to where we're going, why it creates a certain ethic, I guess you could look at. What's coming to my mind is like Jonathan Edwards' Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. that there's an interesting relationship related to working out one's salvation that leads to a certain kind of civilization or society. But it has to, in a sense, it was conscious. And to take it back to the first part of the conversation, it sounds like that it was, in the Dawkins sense and the Harris sense, not conscious anymore, and that we could continue on without it being conscious. And so maybe that's where land is come from.
Well, I think that Dawkins is trying to raise to consciousness our capacity for reason. I think that Sam Harris then started to see the lack in that project, and he starts to break to spirit. And the interesting thing about this is that I feel like it's the unconscious of civilization logically processing itself, that I don't need to like make any large jumps or stretches to say like Dawkins, reason, Harris, spirit, Peterson, religion. This, if you just study the discourse as it unfolds, it unfolds like that. Like Harris immediately breaks, and he defines his break from New Atheism as waking up. He has the Waking Up book, the Waking Up app, the Waking Up podcast, and he defines the book as a guide to spirituality without religion. So it's almost as if Harris is saying, okay, there's a lack in reason, we need to go to spirit. And what is spirit for Harris? It's meditation, psychedelics, this ineffable quality of transcendental love, which has no religious boundaries. And he writes about that. And I think that's something that Dawkins would just scoff at a little bit. Like, I don't know if Dawkins has a meditative life, or I don't know if Dawkins has explored psychedelics. I doubt it. By all accounts, I think no, he hasn't. Or even this ineffable notion of love, or a quality of love that transcends any religious boundaries. I'm not sure how that functions for him metaphysically, or whether he takes that seriously, or whether he thinks that's just an epiphenomenal sort of dimension of social illusion or something like that. But the interesting thing is that when Harris seems to have clearly won out that debate with the New Atheist line, and I think Harris rose in that waking up period to a new level of intellectual significance. The first major conflict he encountered was with Peterson. And on the other side, when Peterson rose to international superstardom, his first major conflict was with Sam Harris. And it was specifically those debates that everyone was watching in the auditoriums was about truth, but it was specifically about truth as it related to spirit and religion. And that defined the contours of the debates. And I do think that was then Peterson doing a kind of consciousness raising among Western society for the importance of religiosity. I think that where that then breaks, for me anyway, and this is why I was interested in the Zizek-Peterson debate, was almost what I would call an unconsciousness raising. Like the consciousness raising about the unconscious, that there's some dimension of lack, that there's some dimension of negativity that we have to tarry with, that we can't overcome. I think you were pointing towards that when you were emphasizing there's a certain relationship to our own salvation that we need to work out, that we can't necessarily transcend or get away from. If Land would say total depravity, or someone like Hegel might say absolute negativity. But there's some sort of reconciliation with total depravity or absolute negativity that we have to come towards. And I would say, just interesting in this context, that where Peterson and the entire Peterson sort of cultural project finds itself right now is, I think, confronting the absolute negativity. It's confronting, the unstable alliances of the MAGA movement. It's confronting the Groypers. It's confronting this political turmoil and a whole bunch of civilizational problems that I don't think they're ready to confront. And I do think that a lot of those things could be organized as an absolute negativity for them. Like he called, for example, Nick Fuentes a vermin and stuff like that, like, and there's a whole bunch of negativity in Fuentes, which we could get into. But, and then the final thing I'll say, the organizing telos of real speculations and what I'm trying to do with this dialectic of new atheism through Dawkins, Harris, Peterson, is that ultimately there is a critique of religion in new atheism in the 21st century, which I think was a lot inspired by 9/11.
Right.
I think it was a lot about concerns about fundamentalist religion, specifically Islam, but somehow Christianity gets lumped into the same category as problematic on the level of a modern technological global civilization. What do we do with that? I think that's largely still unresolved, by the way, is like thinking about how do we think about these things. But that a critique of religion necessarily leads to a critique of politics is the presupposition I've been working with. And that's where I'm pointing. I'm saying there was a critique of religion, which the new atheists never followed through to a critique of politics. And my claim about that is that Dawkins, Harris, and Peterson all share a kind of liberal political background. People often forget that when Peterson first came onto the scene, I mean, he was seen as like a classical liberal, and he was defending like classical liberalism. But what you see downstream of Peterson is, and I think, TLC might be a part of this conversation, you see a desire for a post-liberalism, right? Like you don't find many people who are defenders of liberalism anymore. Like a lot of people are critical of it.
I from my as I look around, I think that the critique is interesting, but when the rubber hits the road, it gets a little nerve-wracking, to say the least. For people that might have called themselves like, I might consider myself political, like a Christian anarchist or something. And then, so that you can kind of have this, it's kind of I'm a libertarian, I don't have to take X. And I think that, but, I kind of like this post-liberal conversation. But then when people become post-liberal, it's like, well, actually, I'm probably still pretty liberal. I think that that's the pattern and myself included, the only thing is that it has everybody's attention. And so it has to be reckoned with, and you can't stick your head in the sand. You can't stick your head in the sand and pretend like it's not happening.
Exactly.
I just watched this Reformed Baptist guy that's making a lot of traction as a Christian nationalist. I think his name's Joel Webbin, and he's, Doug Wilson was just on Sam Harris's podcast. Who's
I watched that.
Yeah, so him, and he was on Doubt That, and I've known about Doug since like 2012 as a Reformed guy. Kind of, he wrote some books, and he was kind of positioned with some of this other. It's called the Gospel Coalition, which was a early aughts Reformed Christian. There was a whole movement called Young, Restless, and Reformed, conservative pushback against liberal Reformed Christianity, and so anyways, Doug. But then this Joel Webbin guy, he said he was asked by somebody. It was just a clip again. These are all these clips, right? What's the big? It said something along the lines of like, okay, he's saying he's a Christian nationalist, and the question was, what's wrong with Christianity? And he said Christians, because they're weak and feminine and gay and all this stuff. As a Christian nationalist is what he was saying, which was very, he's taking that play from Andrew Tate, he's taking this play from, and so these are things, that I'm seeing where it's like, well, that'll get your attention, right? But what I also see is a desire to like, I don't want to look at these things, which is kind of the Petersonian thing that I think you're talking about in a way. It's like, I'm just going to call this dude a rat and we're just going to move on with this project. arc, and and unless you really deal with the shadow, then it's going to kind of eclipse you.
It's the political presuppositions. It's wanting to look at our political presuppositions. Let me give an example. There was a conversation that Peterson was hosting on the Daily Wire. I think looking at the Gospels or looking at studying the biblical stories.
Either the Gospel series or the Exodus series, or the two.
Yeah. Right. And it was a Daily Wire production, right? And they had, Pajot was on, Vervaeke was on. And so this is what I want to frame about that conversation to try and get at these political presuppositions idea. So they had, I think Paul Vanderklay called it a metaphysically conversation, because you had a Jew, you had a Catholic, you had an Orthodox, you had a Protestant, you had the whole
non-theist, even.
You had a non-theist, right? You had the whole diversity there, theologically speaking, discussing the Bible. Great, that's metaphysically. But then we go to the plot. They're all Daily Wire conservatives. I don't think Vervaeke's a Daily Wire conservative, but there's a kind of political background of Daily Wire conservatism, which is the unconscious presupposition of the unity.
Well, yeah. Well, the thing
that when we think about theology, this is my claim. It's just thinking what I call theopolitics. When we think about theology, and I think historically this is sound, like when we think about theology, it's difficult to disentangle it from its political implications. And I think that this even defines the modern world in a sense, with the separation of church and state. Like you're making a certain theopolitical gesture. Like the theopolitical claim is that these two things need to be separated in order for a modern liberal society to emerge and flourish. I know PVK is thinking about this a lot as well. But I think that my claim is that what's appearing in our contemporary conversation in regards to what you were saying is what's on the other side of all this, all of this rupture in the cultural conversation. I think it's the theopolitical. I think that we haven't yet figured out the relationship between theology and politics, and vice versa, the relationship between politics and theology. And it's underlying, the rise of interest in things like Christian nationalism, but also on the left side, like the rise of like someone like Mamdani, who's seen as like I know Fuentes calls him a race communist, but like the connection there with Islam, or the function of Islam, or the function of other religions, the plurality of religions in an American liberal society, and what does that mean? How do we think about that? I mean, these are disorienting questions.
Well, I think, and again, like I'm not a voracious reader, but you listen. I've listened. I've done a lot of reading through sermons, you could say. In the last that's where the distillation of some of these things, or through conversations with the pastor I worked with, I'm kind of working with again, but he went to Yale Divinity. He appreciates he's appreciated academic, theological, philosophical conversation, and spent a lot of time in the office just in conversation about all these things. Like I said, I was talking about Doug Wilson in 2012, and his project was not anything. He was writing books and pastoring a church back then, and whether that was already going on for him is what would happen. It probably was, but to that point, and I think I guess it was Harris did a really good job of getting to his why theology matters. And in my conversation with P.F. Jung, he's starting to see this as well. And he was making, just the way that I just said, I did a lot of reading through sermons, hearing sermons. He says, wow, what pastors talk to their congregations and preach to their congregations about is actually really important and powerful mimetically. And that was what was interesting, talking about these there's 3.5 historical views about the end of all things: post-millennialism, premillennialism, amillennialism, related to a certain scriptural prophecy. And him being a post-millennialist means that they actually believe that it won't be like a spiritual renewal of all things in a way, it's that Christians will usher that in physically, materially. And so that, which is a different than other people's interpretations of the end of all things. And so theology matters, right? Like how teleologically for this people, and if people are going to become more religious post Peterson, these things will then begin to play materially, and then also what you were saying, you're talking to Tim about everyone wants to, this wave that we've seen, and I think hasn't. Well, here's a statistic I saw. I'm in conversation with a lot of Orthodox people, Eastern Orthodox people here, and they are such a small percentage of Western or American Christianity, but I'm pretty sure that they're set to double. So say they are 2% of American Christianity or whatever the number is, they become 4% in like 2 years. That's it's a blip on a chart, but that's a massive cultural, like, for that whole culture or whatever. I don't know what the number is, but it's something like that.
And depending on its force, it could become like it would become. I mean, again, it depends on the force, and it depends on all these factors about how religious transformations occur. But it could become exponential, where 2 becomes 4, becomes 8, becomes 16, becomes 32, and I mean, and
the thing I was
that's how that's how the dogmatic religious mind. I think that's what the dogmatic religious mind of any orientation wants. Like, for example, from an Islamic point of view, like what they want is this exponential doubling to the point where it just takes over the entire field, right? Like where the entire field becomes a certain version of Islam, or the entire field becomes a certain version of Orthodox. And I think that one of the things that I've appreciated about PVK and his work is that I think he's held a Protestant confidence in this transformation, which allows for the acceptance and the inclusion of the Orthodox, even inclusive of Orthodox individuals who believe they'll take over the entire field. But PVK has a disposition which allows him to see a deeper dynamic at work, which might actually short circuit the exponential rise of a certain denomination.
Well, I mean, I just was listening to Redeemed Zoomer on there's another guy.
You follow him, right? Like,
there's another guy in this corner named Marcus who runs a channel called More Christ, and he's had a lot of people on from this corner and whatnot. And he did a conference actually. When I went to ARC, he did a conference in Ireland that I went to with Martin Shaw, Paul Kingsnorth, Paul Vanderklay, and it was called Christ and Culture. And Martin Shaw and Kingsnorth are part of the Orthodox resurgence and this kind of artistic, relation to the old. And there's still a point on going back that I wanted to mention to you about, but related to Paul Vanderklay and the Protestant move. Redeemed Zoomer said he thinks that actually that Protestantism is the actual Catholic Church in that conversation, in the sense of universal church, which the word Catholic means. Like, it actually has the ability to incorporate Catholicism, Orthodoxy, like you were saying. He explicitly said that to Marcus on that just released 2 days ago. But to that point, and I think this goes back to some early related to this whole phenomenon, Peterson, everything. One of the things that Jonathan Bijot talked to David Fuller, who did the first Peterson documentary called A Glitch in the Matrix, and he ran a channel called Rebel Wisdom.
Yeah.
And Jonathan, like, this is the story goes that he was like, well, if you can't, or if you're even in the name Rebel Wisdom is like this would be an interesting question for you, but like, if you're even the word protest, I think is not a good word. Like, I don't want to be identified as a Protestant. I want to be identified as a reformer. And Reformed Catholicity is actually a term that's been used a long time because it's a positive vision for a way forward versus, am I still protesting Martin Luther's Rome? Like, is that still what I'm doing? The protest, and that in itself, as I thought about that, really brought me into a mindset about all the George Floyd protests of, and all this, like, that there's something to that spirit that has gone a long time. And, but I guess the thing I'm trying to get back to is when you were talking with Tim, like, there's a critique of the question of, like, okay, so now you're going to go back to modern or pre-modern or medieval. We have to go forward. And I guess my question was, I don't know if we can ever fully go back. We're always going to have these things, this where we've been. And so whatever is happening with the people that are going back, it's making something completely new in a way, because it's going to be so informed by technology. And if you have a mass influence of Protestants, you don't just shed that consciousness of evangelical when you go into a new place. It impacts, and I don't know. Those are some of the things that I was thinking.
Well, I can say something to that in regards to, one, my own theopolitical biases, as well as what I've taken from studying Zizek's idea of Christian atheism. It's basically, for me, I think it's the difference between how do you understand truth? Do you see truth in the historical origin, or do you see truth in the historical break or cut? And for me, I always see truth in the historical break or cut. In fact, I would even see Hegel's phenomenology of spirit as trying to teach this, that we have a spontaneous temptation to see truth in the origin. Psychoanalytically, you might say it's like some sort of desire to return to the womb or return to an uncorrupted state before I was destroyed by the world. But you could see that in the movement to orthodoxy, right? The desire to reclaim something that's eternal, to reclaim something that hasn't been corrupted by history, that's somehow pure and pristine and kept in a pure and pristine state. And there's all these, theological, I've seen some people talk about, how pure and pristine is this reclaiming of the original Orthodox position? But I see the history of Christianity as the truth of Christianity. What I mean by seeing the history of Christianity as the truth of Christianity is that I see the truth in the breaks and the cuts, like the cuts and the breaks that happen between Orthodoxy and Catholicism, and the cuts and the breaks that happen between Protestantism and Catholicism, and even the cuts and the breaks that happen between Protestantism and liberal secularity. That the truth is in these breaks, but the problem is it's hard to see the truth in those breaks because it brings you to deeper contradictions, which are hard to think. So, for example, and this is I take from Zizek, Zizek sees that protest energy in Protestantism, that it actually leaks outside of Protestantism in name, and it becomes liberal subjectivity. Like, liberal subjectivity is Protestant in the sense that it's protesting, right? It's demanding human rights, right? Rights for X category, Y category, Z category. And even deeper, you could even say that woke subjectivity has a Protestant side to it. It's constantly protesting this and that.
Which is why people are rejecting it, Protestantism.
I know.
Yeah.
And I think, and I understand that. And I want to say that, like, how deeply I understand that, because I could even make the argument that my career has been not destroyed, but significantly derailed by woke subjectivity. Like, I consider myself in the ground zero for where woke subjectivity came from at McMaster University, University of Toronto, where Jordan Peterson was teaching when I was doing grad school. And at first I didn't even understand what was going on. Like, where I was just a young white male, and my embodied performance was a problem. Like, me being in the room was a problem. The story I always say when I was applying for postdocs is that they would have on the university websites we are preferentially looking for identity categories which are not you. So I basically started Philosophy Portal in many ways because there's not really a system set up that values my performative presence. But the point is that I still think that this is the challenge we have to think, is that I think we can't just pretend woke subjectivity can just be, I don't know, systematically annihilated or repressed, because I think that what you get there is a kind of what I would call a woke identitarian mirror.
Well, yeah, that's the woke right that's being
exactly.
Exactly. And that is the question that I guess I'm curious about is there must the truth is in the breaks. There must be something true here, right? There must be something true here that's been ignored.
Absolutely.
And I think that is difficult because, 15, 20 years ago during those atheist religion debates, there was not, you couldn't see the water that you were swimming in. I just got a comment from a guy who in the corner, he's one of the few black men who has paid attention to this corner for his name's Teo. And he said that my conversation with Ben Boyce was so good because he's seen this whole thing for the whole time as kind of a white man's revolution. And I was like, wow, and there's the truth. Okay, so now we go the shadow side. Like I was talking, that video I made about Nick Fuentes, like, oh, is the shadow of Jordan Peterson, the mimetic, nemesis, because you can't, but I don't think that the woke people on the left could have, okay, if we make the white man, the white devil, like the epitome of evil, then it's like, he can't play this game that but then they're like, oh, we can play the game and we're going to. So, oh man. So here we are. And we are, all this stuff happening with Tucker and everything on the right.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, it's so funny because it's like, no, Trump's going to be the biggest authoritarian. And they're like, now it's like, oh, Trump just wanted to be Biff from Back to the Future. That's way different.
That's great.
That's way different than wanting to, be race conscious, like.
So my relationship to this was, again, so like 2016, I'm deep in Zizek's philosophy. And you know what he says about Trump? And he got canceled by the left for this. Like Zizek said, we should vote for Trump because it will accelerate system chaos.
Yeah.
So that there will be a coherent left response to the chaos. Like he was like doing like an accelerationist dialectical reversal. Like, because he said, if we vote for Clinton, the system will just stay the same. So we have to vote for the chaos, and then there'll be but then the weird thing is that, the deepest reaction I see from Trump is then going even further right. Like I don't want to use the word fascist because it's overused, but I mean, I don't think it's a mischaracterization to say that Fuentes is at least fascist adjacent or, neo fascist.
And at the very least, a fascist provocateur.
Yeah, sure. And then the question is, to what extent will this lead to real policy that start? I mean, and I guess people on the left would say, well, ICE is already that, or something like that. But so anyway, we get into these. We get into this mess.
Well, this is my corner thesis, and I saw this presented by a young man who's a very conservative guy. He was on a Young Brits podcast. This guy named Elliot Betwick, who was at ARC. He's like early 20s. He's trying to do the Chris Williamson thing. He's really high production, like quick questions and, kind of modern sociology and this kind of thing.
It's like, what is it? The Chris Williamson thing. It's like, what is it? It's like these, I put Diary of a CEO in the same category. They're like these hyper productive, like we can't miss even a minute of the day, like we have to, like I think it's that they equate truth with efficiency, like we have to be completely efficient, productive, and
that you are a product in a sense, like, so I want to sell a really good, like, high quality product, so there's that. And I you know, I have my sympathies for that. but as a good, Eva, the big Eva thing that's still, a part of me. But the thing that he had on this guy who's a young early 20s guy that's getting involved in British politics, very conservative. And, I don't even know how to put the words into just, these young Gen Z that are, he's very much like the Redeem Zoomer guy. He's like very outspoken, very direct. I'm a Christian and blah, 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 blah. It's a very different way of speaking about your Christianity than the millennial Gen X kind of, I'm still cool, bro. Like, so to get my point, he outlined, and in Reformed theology, there's covenantal theology, which is about God, that God did these different covenants throughout history. And the way that it's usually taught is related to kind of a person's relation, like that individual. So you had Adam, you have Moses, you have Abraham, you have like, and they have these covenants, but God makes these covenants, and you can see them outlined through scripture. And he went through them really quick, but he did something different that I had not heard before. Is he attached these covenants to identity, and he created an ontological identity stack from these, and he did it quickly, and I just was blown away in that moment. And I added something a little bit to it, but was that, so there's the covenant with Adam, which is the person, which is, because you're always religiously in relationship to the divine as a person, not as a
Are you going to take me through the stack?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Yeah.
And then there's Adam and Eve, which is, the marriage, the covenant of marriage. And then you have Noah, which is the covenant of the household. And then you have Abraham, which is the covenant of tribe. And then you have Moses, which is the covenant of nation. And then you have David, which is the covenant of kingdom. And then you have Christ, which is the covenant of the church. And I was blown away by that, because he attached them like to those identity, those fractal identities, to use like a Peugeotian view on it. It's like, and that the church then goes all the way back down. Like, it's like, and then everything is across. And so when we come to this conversation post Peterson, Nick Fuentes, race consciousness on the left and now the right, I think that was the most helpful thing that I'd ever, as a Christian, encountered, related to how that these things actually have a place, and that we were given some model through our, revelatory scripture that's a kind of a meta narrative of how identity works. And that we find ourselves in, like, we are at all of these all the time, but that what seems to be the conversation that is currently taking place, whether it's like, well, we got to go back to orthodoxy, or no, we need a new monarchical vision. It's like, and it's like, no, all these things, we actually need to acknowledge that these things all exist. It's not one or the other. And it feels like all these ideologies have been trying to pick, no, you're the individual. No, we're a kingdom. No, we're a nation. No, we're the church. We're only these things, as opposed to all of these things. And it was just like, I don't know, that was what hit me related to what we're going through right now. And it's kind of, I guess it's something I feel like I'm holding on to as kind of a ballast, in the sense of the intensities that are surrounding this conversation.
The weird thing for me is twofold. When I first started studying, I was studying in anthropology. And anthropology gives you the point of view of the universal human from the perspective of evolution. That we're all like that race, tribe, nation, kingdom, church. All of these things are secondary to the universal human. From philosophy, I think there's a presupposition of universal subjectivity, and that all of these different categories are something like epiphenomenal. And I want to be self-critical of myself in my own presuppositions in terms of things I assumed while I was studying. I always found these categories of universal human through evolution or universal subjectivity from the perspective of philosophy to be very convincing and helpful. But at the same time, in terms of like practical human social reality, like I can't deny that race or tribe or nation or country don't materially function in terms of my unconscious. And it goes pretty deep. Like how much do I care if my child looks like me racially? Right? Like, for some people that might matter, for some people that might not matter. But I think it has a material effect for a lot of people. There's a way in which I feel like we have to stay true to the idea of the universal human and true to the idea of universal subjectivity, while at the same time taking into consideration this fractal that you outlined. That it's not like that, it has to be thought together. Like that if you pretend it's irrelevant, like if I was to pretend that these things were irrelevant, I think I would be duped. I would be the one in illusion, not the person who's taking them seriously.
And so on a historical outline, there's, when we look at the evolution of all those things through history, those different covenants, fractal covenants, and then also at the same time, there's always this very personal reality, which you talk about, like the universal humanity, the kind of, and at the core of that, the starting point is like this, the phrase, the theological phrase is given, imago Dei, the image of God, right? That's like at the core, and that never goes away, and that even though these things all exist, and it pulls us into different scales of relationship, there is still always a like personhood, and why the human rights of the 60s and of like the ending of slave trade and these things, like they do come back to the importance of the individual or the person, and we have put our lens upon that, individual rights, and I think it's like this, as I'm sitting here thinking about this, it comes back to like, well, you have we need to create like programs for the down and out, right? But then the opposite is like, so for that person, and you use this, a person will use like, you can hear Barack Obama's voice talking about some individual in Ohio that's tells a story during his campaign about some person, right? And at the flip side, on the right, they're saying, yeah, okay, no, that person or that individual needs to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, right? And you're still just talking about the person or whatever, when the conversation shouldn't be at the expense either way, but that we're looking at it at different places, and how different parts of this, covenantal stack deal with groups and persons in different ways. And it just seems like we've been in a very, we can't be, we've moved beyond kingdom, and which was another really interesting point that you had in your conversation with Tim Alden, was how we really looked at whatever the French Revolution, the implications, and of monarchy related to that. And it's like, oh, we're past monarchy now, right? Of course we're past monarchy. So now let's just go ahead.
That's my point with this stuff.
Yeah.
Is that when you see like a Curtis Yarvin, like talking about, like, it's kind of like the way I see that is like, oh, there's a problem or a tension in the transition from monarchy to liberal state, which we're still haunted by.
Yeah.
Like it won't go away. Like there's still something there that our culture needs to reprocess. And in regards to like left and right, what you were saying about, you know, in many ways, you can see the political dialectic being something that always sees itself as split between rights and responsibilities, or equality and hierarchy, right? Like that's one that I always see. I always question among some of my leftist friends when they're talking about politics and they talk about the telos of politics as equality. Well, I always say, but if I'm talking to someone on the right, they're going to much more emphasize a value hierarchy than equality. And they're going to actually see the value hierarchy as more important than the equality. And how do we think about the tension between equality and hierarchy? So I always, and that's like kind of like the point of the dialectical logic, like the Christian atheism thing or whatever. It's like, how do you see, whenever you, like, that's the point, is like, whenever you see some opposition, like rights, responsibilities, like, are you going to make the argument for rights? Or are you going to make the argument for pulling yourself up by the bootstrap? Are you going to make the argument for equality? Or are you going to make the argument for a certain hierarchy? Like, it's how do we see these things in some sort of weird unity where actually they both need each other, but they're fundamentally in a tension?
I mean, I, I think in our last conversation, we talked about, you developing some kind of relationship to Christianity through suffering and the crucifix or the cross or this image. And it does seem to me, I wrote this piece over on Substack and I sent it to you. Just like I use the word sacro-theonomy, which, you were talking about the theopolitic, I think, the theopolitical, and other conversations I've had, like, I introduced you to Ross Bird this year, and he talks about the divine economy, and so you have the political, you have the economical, you have the religious, these things, and then you have like Vervaeke talking about the sacred, and there's all this relationship that we're trying to grapple with. He would say, like, to get that optimal grip, on all this stuff, and for me, there was a grappling with how to attend to something as if it is sacred. And as is a Petersonian approach that then ended up getting people through a door to not as if, but I do attend to this as sacred, and that there's something about this left, I can't remember, we were at the Midwest History Conference, and the way that Vervaeke, during his conversation, he kept making a crucifix when he was talking about these relationships. And so, there's like this polis, it's only a relational polis, and it's, for the rights of individuals or individual responsibility. And it's like, there's something that has to be done. And it's not like, I'm not talking about a third way, like not necessarily in a sense, like a synthesis, but it's like, well, it does. I mean, and this is where I was so.
To me, the third way, like, could I say the third way might be on the cross itself?
Well, yeah, but that's Peterson. I mean, because that's what he said. He said that voluntary self-sacrifice is related to all of this. Either way, you have to. There's a time where you have to give. Either way,
I think that's what deepens the spiritual love. Like the reason why, that's why I think the reason why you go from Sam Harris to Peterson is because Sam Harris is talking about like a vague spirituality with a transcendent love that defines that transcends religious boundaries. But I think if you miss the cross, like you miss a kind of sieve or a narrow, what is it that Christ says about going through the eye of through an eye of a needle?
Mm-hmm.
Like there's a way in, like, and I guess that's, so I want to run this axiom by you, is that the axiom I used for the Christian atheism course was Christianity is the truth of religion and atheism is the truth of Christianity. And I want to say like how radical these principles are, because like Christianity is the truth of religion. What does that mean? It means that there was actually a religious innovation, a discovery within Christianity that brought the transcendent into a bodily human reality. Like it brought, like the transcendent divine was not some omnipotent, all-knowing beyond of all human beings, but it was dying on a cross all of a sudden. Like, and there was something in that transformation which represented a truth, I would say a break, a cut, which now our civilization you can't love in a pagan way anymore. Like it's like the pagan love versus the Christian love. And then atheism is the truth of Christianity. We could go deep down that rabbit hole, but for me, I would like to link it to, you were mentioning the sacred. And I think the dialectical opposite of the sacred is the profane.
Right.
And we need to think the sacred and the profane. And how does the sacred and the profane function in our spontaneous theological consciousness? Like, you know, the profane outside that we need to keep away from our sacred inside. And actually, to me, Christ, I mean, you tell me if I'm wrong, like for me, Christ is with the profane.
I see. Yeah. So,
You know?
yeah, that was.
That's what I like about PDK as well. He always says that, like, but you know why he does the Freddie and Paul show?
Right.
It's because he's kind of with the outside. He's with the what people would consider trash. You know what he said about what you should do about the homeless? He said, talk to them. You know, like he said, people come to him and say, what do we do about the homeless? Should we give them some food? Should we set up political programs that get them housing? He said, talk to them, like just have a conversation. And there is, you know, there is something there which yeah.
Well, so to go to the and this, you know, reminds me of part of my conversation with Brenda Graham Dempsey. And, you know, he wrote a kind of a epic poem about the death of God. Right. And it's not this, but even so the heart of atheism. So if God dies and God goes away, there is no, you know, a God, there is not a God or something in that sense. God dies. What does that mean? So, and that was what I hear in relationship to atheism being at the heart of Christianity when you say that. And the only other, there was another side of it though, that in the Christian religion that Paul says that without the resurrection, we're fools ultimately, because anyone can die. And so that is then what comes out of that. And that must mean something, not must, but like when you get to that stack, well, what was the church? The church is what came out of that. And so then there was another piece, the sacred and the profane. And
this is so crucial.
Well, the sacred and the profane that comes to my mind is what we saw with COVID was the people that were able to talk were the comedians. The people that were able, that kind of pushed the envelope were the profane. They would make fun of the science. The ones that had the courage to, you know, Rogan being the kind of example on that. But it's like Peugeot talks about the margins, and we had that conversation on our philosophy portal conversation, but there's like, you can't just make it go away. You can't just like all this stuff there. You have to figure out what is the relationship. And it seems like that's your Hegelian foundations, you know, is usually constantly asking that question. And the relationship to the profane, you have to have the sacred to even recognize that something is a profane. And I do think that as a lot of it was taken for granted, even by, you know, the Dawkinses of the world, like, oh no, Christmas, you know, keep it Christmas, right? Like it, and it's like, well, what happens when it's profaned or it's negated? And you're like, well, you have to recognize that it comes from something. And even so, the profane, in my conversation with Benjamin, he said that all the, you know, we get that word profanity, but like the use the trigger words that somebody like Fuentes and Kanye are using in our culture to, well, Fuentes more probably, but is
Fuentes would be the profane here.
well, but yeah, he's using the profane to actually separate, to get, and this was actually what Benjamin said about Tucker, is he's using this to kind of separate the wheat from the chaff in a way to like, I'm going to talk to you about the things that are really real, and if you can't get past these words points, then you're not even gonna. He's using the profane as like a shell in a way,
like the way he talks about Jews, or the way he talks about race in general, or the way he talks about women, or the way
it's kind of a shell to something
like,
else.
can you, like, are you triggered by this, or can you withstand the triggering to the point where we can have a deeper conversation that's on the possible other side of the triggering?
Yeah, I think there's
I feel like, because I feel like there's truth in that. Like, I feel like, because my spontaneous reaction at the moment is that, like, Shapiro's kind of systematic cancellation and ostracization of Fuentes reveals a negative truth about Shapiro. Like, I would almost have more respect for Shapiro if he confronted Fuentes face on rather than creating the monster.
It's hard, and it's hard to
know, but this is all along the lines of like censorship and cancellation.
Yeah.
And like, who's on the inside and who's on the outside. And when, like PVK says, hierarchies bind and blind.
Yeah.
It's like that. It's like, you create a hierarchy, it does some good. It's sacred. Like, you create a hierarchy, it binds you. And that, like, I'm talking about, like, let's say Daily Wire as a hierarchy.
Yeah.
And it binds you and it does something good, but then it also blinds you to something. And whenever you create a sacred inside, there's always going to be a profane outside. And the question is, what is the ethic of the relationship between the sacred inside and the profane outside? And how is that boundary navigated? Who's on the inside? Who's on the outside? Because, what's that old saying that, like, because this, like, to me strikes at the core of Fuentes's character, is like, it's almost like, if you don't provide a village to keep the child warm, the child will come back and burn it down just to feel the warmth.
Oh, yeah.
And I think that's what Fuentes is doing. Like, he's just burning it down.
Yeah.
Because it didn't keep him warm, and it kicked him out on the outside, and it said, we don't care about you, and we'll debank you, and we'll deplatform you, and we'll make sure no one ever hears your name. And so you could see Fuentes in his own total depravity, in his own absolute negativity, saying, okay, I'm going to come back and I'm going to burn this mother down.
Yeah, it creates something. It makes me think of two things. Oh man, this is powerful. Well, it makes me think of Harry Potter. It almost emotionally, I'm going through a Harry Potter phase. And it's like, he could have been Slytherin. Like, he could have, like,
oh damn. Sorting Hat, put your kid in Slytherin. Now that's tough.
Like, he could have been the way that he was treated under the stairwell as a rat in his own home, rejected by his own family. Like, he could have become the next Voldemort. But instead he was cared for. Like, so, like, this other family came around him, Professor McGonagall and Albus Dumbledore. And this is what I look at that. What I didn't know much about Fuentes until I knew he was there. And then the Charlie Kirk thing, someone sent me his response to that, and I got very, very curious watching that.
Yeah.
And then I watched him go on Patrick Bet-David, and then I watched him go on, and I watched
he did the rounds.
Yeah, and then the Tucker one, but the Patrick Bet-David, and there was parts of the Tucker, it was like, these guys broke through the bullshit and even on publicly, they kind of like chastised him, about some things. And they got to this, they heard his story, and I think that in a sense, they kind of
They
softened
humanized him.
Yes, and not, which is dangerous to some people. It seems like that's a dangerous path, but I don't think that is the dangerous path. It's actually to make a person more human that was dehumanized. And
Yeah.
so, which, sounds like I'm being soft on this, his rhetoric, which I don't know enough.
Well, with this, look, so I would say we like someone like Fuentes. So this, what let me see if you agree with this. For someone like Fuentes, the path is to humanize them, but also for the people in his field and people in maybe adjacent fields of a similar Gen Z militancy, young guys especially who feel like they're on the outside. I think there also needs to be a way to humanize the way they see women, or to humanize the way they see blacks, or to humanize the way they see Jews. Like, because currently they don't see them as, on the level I was talking about before, like universal human, or they don't see them as universal subject.
Yeah. And to me, when I think about it, is I think about these because they're also being pointed towards religion. And this comes up to this word, this sacred word of communion. And then the insider-outsider distinction that we're talking about, this was the other piece of that conversation just now, because in certain traditions, you need to be baptized or catechized before you partake in this sacred participation, right? And there's like a boundary or a threshold that you must pass through to come into a fractal of communion with God and man. And that's why these things, where we look at from traditional theology, it's like, oh, is this the real body and blood? Is this, no, it's a symbol. It's not. It's like, we're not talking about what's happening when we do this together. And there's some really interesting theologians in the 19th to early 20th century that were Reformed, a guy named John Williamson Nevin, and another guy named Schaff, Schaff was the Protestant who wrote translated the church fathers that a lot of the Orthodox people read, was translated by a Protestant named Schaff. And his mentor, Nevin, talked about the mystical presence of communion being a binding agent, and it's a crucifix binding agent, because what's taking place when we do that is an embodiment of so much of what we're talking about. But it's the embodiment of it is in some ways more powerful than the propositions that we want to label what's actually happening theologically. And so there's this.
That's a crucial one, and it's so difficult to think through the tensions of that.
Yeah, because we're talking about insider outsider exclusivity and these types of things, but that's not
how
really
we signify to each other versus how we embody our day-to-day ritual, how we embody our day-to-day being, what we've gone through, how we are carrying our cross, or how we are positioned on the cross might be something that only we know.
Yeah.
Like, it might be a silent suffering, something that can't be turned into a symbol where I can performatively use it for a social credential or a social currency.
And so that's what, that makes me think of is that scripture, where two or more are gathered, there I am. That's what that kind of makes me think of, because maybe you don't feel that there's something true that can take place in communion, something like dialogos, something like a friend to somebody that is suffering, and not even know it. There was an ad not too long ago where these two guys are at like a football game, and one of them is woo, and the other guy's just kind of like hanging out with their friends, and they keep going, and then all of a sudden the guy that was real excited is gone, and the one that's kind of just chilling is sad because they communicate that the one that was real excited actually was committed suicide. And it was like related to, you just don't know what's going on, even, like just like you said, carrying something silently or whatever. That's what that made me think of. But man, we've like kind of
I've got a high school friend group chat with guys who are always just obsessed with sports.
Yeah.
And we've got one going because our favorite team growing up was the Toronto Blue Jays. They were just in the World Series.
That's right.
And we just had a devastating loss in Game 7.
Oh, man.
And it just makes me think about, there's those guys in the group chat that are super excited, and what is the difference between the appearance of their excitement versus whatever their day-to-day actual life is, and that, even I think when I was in the group chat during the playoffs, a lot of my thoughts were actually about religious enthusiasm, about how religious enthusiasm is actually being transmitted through sport.
Yeah.
And that is actually where ceremony, communion can be expressed for a lot of people. Because I'm thinking, look, the Toronto Blue Jays, they got a stadium that seats 50,000 people.
Yep.
And they play every day. And that stadium is packed every day. Like that, and like, what is that? Like 50,000 people. That's Holy Spirit.
It's spirit, it's liturgy. Yeah.
Yeah.
And the stats and the legends and the mythos of the players.
That is creative theology for me. I love that. I would dedicate my life to that. Is like the study of like that would be to me a proposition I would have for Viveki about a future scientific theology. It would be seeing theology in places where we don't think theology. Like we don't spontaneously, we don't think like it's in the football stadium, it's in the baseball stadium, it's at the music concert.
It's There's this interesting meme. It's not a meme, but there's this band called Skillet, and they've been a Christian rock band, heavy metal band since the early 90s. I was 10 years old, and my mom gave me 2 CDs because we used to be a part of this like CD club, and one of them was their first album, and it was the kind of Christian attempt to sound like Nirvana. Their album it was a grunge attempt, and then they've gone through iterations. So their lead singer now is probably in his 50s, but they just released a heavy metal version of O Come Emmanuel. It's kind of making its way on X as this kind of like, they're all dressed in black and they're all just, thrashing, and it's around this sacred tune, Christian tune, haunting tune. And and there's this other question about McLuhan's "The Medium is the Message" and how this, how we relate to this song in other mediums, and it's coming through this one, and it seems offensive because it seems like sacrilege, and the thing that it made me think of in my experience with these arenas, or these the medium and the message with kind of Christian worship music, which this was something kind of beyond that. This was Christian, it was heavy metal music with a Christmas carol, which has been, why does that feel different than the Manchester Orchestra or whatever that does like the the Christmas carol or whatever, and they're using electric guitars. But there's something about like what U2, Coldplay, and then subsequently bands like Delirious and Hillsong United, which were Christian bands, they took the medium of arena rock and they consecrated it. But then people try to take that arena rock and put it in their like 200-person sanctuary in rural Arkansas, and it's like, what? It doesn't come across the same way.
It doesn't work. I think this is what the science of theology would be trying to get at. I think it's like what you were saying about the the heavy metal music with a Christmas Carol. Like they're playing with form and content, obviously. Like it's like the content is being expressed in an alien form, and the form is over determining the content.
Yeah.
In a paradoxical way. I guess my proposition to you about this, Reversals, if you agree or not, to me, the misrecognition, I would see it as like a misrecognition by the people who are holding the Christian identity to take the U2 and Coldplay and to try and fit it into the Christian form, rather than seeing the U2 and Coldplay as already the theological expression itself. Like it's the evolution of God, or it's the evolution, like U2 and Coldplay are already the evolution of God. Like that's already where it's being expressed.
Yes. And of course, both of those bands flirted with religious themes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But you can, like I feel like if I went to study like my favorite bands and rappers and artists from like the last 30, 40 years, like there is theological innovation in their music already.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, just even the blues being connected to slave hymns in the cotton field, you know, like it's like, it seems inescapable like that. And why what you're doing is so interesting related to this, like you said, just wanting to can we get past that? And it was,
Right.
You know, that being the impulse.
That's post-human fantasy. Is getting past that. Like I think that like if I'm right, if this axiom Christianity is the truth of religion, and like I'm thinking about this as like a fundamental phenomenological structure which every newborn has to go through: reason, spirit, religion, absolute knowing. That what that means is that, you know, it's like what Pajot says, like there is something ontologically true about the story of the crucifixion. And it's not, as it were, like historically contingent and arbitrary in this, like it's contingent in how you come across the structure of the cross. Like for me, it's contingent in a completely different way than it is for you. But we both found the cross.
Yeah.
You know, and we both found a truth there. And there's something, and it can take surprising forms. Like, and that's, I think that is the Protestant breakthrough. Like what Protestantism opens up is the very form in which the cross is historically discovered, so to speak. Like, and that's why I think Protestantism breaks open into so many different forms. Like, I think Protestantism splinters into and I want to bring that back to that point to see if it's worth investigating. It's like the people who convert to Orthodoxy see the divisions in Protestantism as the falsity of Protestantism. Like, because Protestantism divides, that means it's untrue. Whereas I see it the opposite way. The fact that Protestantism divides is proof of its truth. Like the fact that it can withstand all these divisions.
That's maybe still a question. That's maybe a question up for debate, but it's still
totally. This is just totally my bias, and I'm just speculating here. I'm not. I don't know. I'm telling you just what my bias is.
Real speculations. Plug the book. I mean, I hear that word divide, division, as the Christian response is they will know us by our unity, or Christ would, in this great prayer in the book of John, was like, they'll know us by our love for one another, or by our unity. And so what comes to my mind with this is there is, but even within Orthodoxy, there is disunity among the different ethnos. Russian and Greek are not, I mean, these different churches aren't in communion. They're divided. And even just
that
that's that simple thing that Redeemed Zoomer said to Marcus was like, I think Protestantism, it could be the biggest church in a sense, of course. And again, he has his own versions of exclusionary claims to a Christian orthodoxy, but like
Hegel called it the invisible church. like
Yeah.
in the sense that like you could like the church appears in places where you can't even recognize it as a church.
Yeah.
And that leads me to that leads me to the speculative theology of theology at the Blue Jays game and theology at the U2 concert. You know, like it's like it's an invisible church.
Yeah, and there's, I mean, when I was coming up, there actually was a lot, you know, which these conversations with Peter Rollins and even like to the Rob Bell types, like there was a big push to identify Christ in culture in a way like that. There was like a you know, I had a friend growing up that wouldn't watch any movie that had profanity in it, zero. So we, hey, let's hang out, dude. And all right, what movie are we gonna watch? And it's like, oh man, this is gonna be lame. I love you, buddy. And he got past that, but it was because I had in a chapel at our Christian college. He basically talked about finding the sacred in the secular. That was the title of the talk of the chapel sermon. And he came back from that like, I'm going to go watch The Gladiator. I'm going to go watch like things he never would have watched previous for that very reason. And so there has been an alive conversation. I think that in evangelicalism has dealt with that in a certain way, but actually to excess in a way that I think that's the part of the Orthodox reaction is to the excesses of it. Like, you know, what's the difference between a Turning Point USA conference and an evangelical Sunday morning church? Like, I don't know. And so like, or a mega church version, at least, you know, and so because there's this dance with modern, you know, production culture, like, because it also looks like the set of like, what's like American Idol or whatever the newest one is, you know, like these sets all look alike, the mega church and the Turning Point. Like, so there's something there where
form.
Yeah, the form is there's a reaction against the form towards the something that seems or maybe is more sacred.
Well, I think this disorientation, we have to think about it both ways. So I'm not thinking about myself as non-disoriented. I feel like I am disoriented. I wanted to say specifically about finding the sacred in the secular.
Yeah.
Going both ways. It also means that people in the secular can't escape the sacred. Right. Like, and that's where and to me, that would be my opposite criticism towards the secular is like, you think you can get away from the sacred. But I would say then like the American Idol and like these kinds of things, these are like, they become like low level sacred.
Yeah.
Because you're not really reflecting deeply about the fact that you can't escape the sacred actually. So it just becomes narcissistic. It becomes image capture. It's not like in the image of God. It's in the image of my ego.
Yeah. Well, and that's the big critique ultimately. But so really where I feel like this question goes because the reaction of the 60s to the kind of hyper buttoned up pietistic religious expressions, again, you talk about these breaks, Vatican II, like I like that proposition you put forward, like the truth is in the break. And even though there's this reaction to want to go back to Latin Mass, my question is, because I sense that, I feel that myself. It's not like I'm above that wanting to approach something.
No, neither am I.
But why did it happen? It happened for a reason, and it probably happened for a good reason. And so this question of on what's beyond, what's the meta to that is still one that's interesting to me because I'm in this interesting place in life where my daughter, who's about to turn 16, is musically talented, and I spent 15 years of my life completely devoted to the modern rock Christian project. And she has a really different relationship to it than they still like, the kids still prefer that style in a way, as even though like at our church gatherings and worship, I steer us towards something more reverent in a general sense, even though we still use some of the songs, but the form's a little different, simpler. But when the kids get together, they still like want to do drums and guitars and all these, it's like, and I kind of still came up because the South was behind like the Jesus movement on the coast. That was happening with like the hippies. That was still like, that's devil music. That's, and so then now it's like, it's ubiquitously Christian, what people identify as like mainstream Christianity is all this stuff that was devil music, right? And and so now there's a counter reform to that I sense, that I feel that people are, because of this hyperinflated ego that comes with that thing or whatever. And so I think you have a good framework in asking the two things, which what are the spirit of these things, and then also the truth is in the break. And so it sounds like we're watching a return to tradition from this dialectic, from this pendulum. And it's like, I think the question you were asking on Tim's conversation, whether we were talking about politics or we're talking about religion, the return to the older traditions or return to the monarchy, is, are we just saying, oh no, let's just go back? And this is part of what I've put forward multiple times, is there has to be, and this would maybe be, I don't know Lacan at all, hardly, but so I don't know, but the kind of psychoanalytic perspective for me is, you can't, there's an impulse to just reject and hate the cage stage of whatever you go through, like Martin Luther rejecting Catholicism, like cage stage. And then it's like, no, but let's keep this stuff. There's like a, instead of there being, it would be easy for me to just go, I'm just going to go Catholic. Okay. I'm just going to get rid of this whole project. And it's like, I would be kind of like, be doing a disservice to it myself in a kind of way. So go, no.
Well, Hegel's word for it is sublation. So in the integral tradition, I think it's more related to what do they call it? Sublation and Wilber's idea are not identical, but it's like the transcend and include. In the integral, it's transcend and include. I forget if there's a word for that mechanism, but in Hegel, it's sublation. It's a cancel and lift. So, like, for example, Martin Luther would be like canceling Catholicism, but he would be proposing to lift it to a new form in Protestantism in a way that kept the best aspects of Catholicism, but got rid of what needed to be canceled. And I think, I really think sublation for me is the most important concept, because when it comes to whether it's the people on the, say, Christian nationalist side or people on the ethno-nationalist side, there's a problem of sublation here. So whether it's we need to go back to monarchy, it's like we don't know how to lift liberalism, right? Or we need to go back to orthodoxy, we don't know how to lift Protestantism, right? So there's this problem that's emerging on both sides. And I think the key thing for me with the critique of religion going to the critique of politics is that these things will have downstream effects on policy, right? So when we're talking, I think we're talking about concrete things, when we're talking about should women have the right to vote, or what should women's representation in institutional bodies be, or should we repeal some of the civil rights legislations related to segregation? And there are people who make arguments, blacks were better before under the Jim Crow laws, right? All of these things are they have practical policy implications at the end of the day about how we interface with difference. And at the same time, so that's criticism on the one side, but my criticism on the other side would be that the liberal plurality, the liberal subjectivity, it doesn't take difference seriously enough. It pretends
yes.
all of these things are just, self-evidently reconciled.
Yes.
It's not really true in any way. And so consequently, you'll have people on the right side, Benjamin Boyce and Nick Land were saying, they create the enemy out of like they call it like a globalist soup, or like I think the Malcolm and Simone Collins call it, like they have a name for it. It's like this global sludge. Sorry, the urban monoculture.
Yeah,
the urban monoculture. It's kind of like this amorphous blob of difference, which is just the same at the end of the day. Like it's so. I mean, I really think we need to take this. That's how I basically see this political problem. It's like on the one side, on the right side, I think it's the problem of sublation. How do we lift without just going back?
Yeah.
And then on the left side, it's like, how do we actually think about difference in a way that we don't get triggered by things which might make us feel uncomfortable about inequality? Because the leftist telos is so organized by equality that it blinds itself to difference and hierarchy and all these things about race and gender get all tied up with hierarchy and about superiority and inferiority and all these types of things which drive us insane.
It's it was fascinating because I do think it created an inversion of hierarchy, and it was still a hierarchy. But the George Floyd was made the king. He was made a king, and
yeah.
And so I know there's a lot that could be said about that. I'm not trying to make a statement. It's just what I observed. So
it's true.
So you had this inversion.
I mean, a Martin Luther King mural and a George Floyd mural, I mean, these are different things. Like it's like we've lost the plot somewhere.
And so, however, like you were saying, this the question of what to do with difference is it is fraught. Because liberalism comes about in this insular American, there is difference between a Protestant and Catholic. There is a difference between an Italian and an English person, but there are degrees of difference, of shared lineage. There's degrees and this is even,
this argument you're making, like Fuentes makes this argument to say immigration at the end of the 19th century in America was okay. Yeah, we had an English settler population and we had immigrants from Italy, from
Ireland,
from across Europe, which for Fuentes, that's okay because they're still white. But now we have the problem of difference between, let's say, whites, and now you have Indian populations on H-1B visas. You have Chinese population. You have Africans coming over, making Haitian.
The liberal lie is that there's no limit to difference, and I think that everyone's realizing, or should be at least, and we have to reckon with it. And there's different ways to reckon with it. Fuentes is going to say bombastic things. He's going to, at least on the outset or whatever. But like, I just say that it's kind of real because even like what happens in prisons, it's a breakdown. It's an ethnos breakdown in prisons whenever they're there's tribes within this constraint of hyper aggressive groups, and
they go into ethnic groups
immediately. And, and so what do you just ignore that? Like well, that's only there or whatever. It's like, okay, well, and I'm not like, here's the thing, like so what lifts liberalism? What did Protestantism do? Well, my dad was adopted from South Korea because they didn't want half Korean babies in their society. And this Protestant program, this missionary goes to a tiny church in nowhere, Arkansas. And my grandparents, who were in their 50s, decide to adopt some of these half Korean babies. That's a liberal project. That's a Christian liberal project in a Methodist church, which they're known for kind of their, bleeding heart, liberalism in a way. And that was in the 50s or the 60s. That was in the early 60s in a very conservative world, redneck Arkansas. And, my dad comes to this place and he doesn't fit anything, like he doesn't look like his parents. He doesn't look, and there's a black population in our town, but there was like no Asian population. And so, he grows up with different identities, and then I grow up here, and what's crazy is like my mom is, second cousin, 6 generations removed from George Washington. And it's like, you have this crazy, relationship. And so liberalism did something good for me, right? And I agree, but I also think that we can't continue to, like, there's been a lot of psychological studies about how devastating it is to adopted kids to be told, I don't see your, I just see you as my child. I don't see your ethnic background. I don't see like that's like not acknowledging a part of reality. And
and I think mixed people talk about this all the time.
Yeah. So what happens, and I think we're in this question that we're at, and Coleman Hughes is mixed, and he's a big liberal voice related to all this stuff, but it's like there is we're in a liminal time between two worlds. And I just had a conversation with a guy named Boss Van Os. His sons kind of participate. One of them has a YouTube channel called Lucas Van Os. Have done like corner conversations, and he's a theologian from the Netherlands, and Boss, his dad is, and we just had a conversation, and he's done this project called I don't have the website pulled up, but he's doing kind of a first person perspective of the New Testament church. And what he's doing some interesting race realism that was taking place between Paul was raised a Hellenistic Greek, Timothy too, Titus was a Greek, and then they're going into Jerusalem to meet with Peter and James, who are trying to figure out Christianity in the Jewish church. And then they come in and they have all this like tension that's real, that took place at the core of this project.
Yeah.
And we can't escape it, but I would even say, there's
what
been
is the ethnos related to tribe in your fractal?
I haven't thought
because if we're the ethnos,
I
think ethnicity has to
in liberalism
come into this fractal somewhere.
Well, I would say it's more connected to your house. I think it probably depends on where you live, maybe, but
between the household and the tribe, maybe.
Yeah,
I guess it could be even seen in the marriage.
Yeah, because it might depend on where it breaks down, and then
how deep is ethnos? How important is ethnos?
Well, but then you have to figure out how you're relating to your. Is the ethnos a kingdom? Is the ethnos a nation? Is the ethnos a tribe? And
are we misrecognizing ethnos if we misplace it in a certain category?
Yeah. And I think, again, there's been too much of this binary, and the liberalism hasn't had enough space to adequately deal with it. Even though the progressive think that they're dealing with it, but they're dealing with it by saying you have to adhere to just some giant monoculture. Like
they're not dealing with it.
Yeah. But they say they are. That's the thing. It's
I know.
It's a gaslight. So
yeah. But I think that there's all these kind of like weird reversals and performative contradictions where people who I'm not saying this universally about either category. So like there are progressives who think they're dealing with race and ethnos, but they're not. I think there are people who are fundamentalist Christians who think they're dealing with Christ, but they're not. Like I think there's all these weird identity reversals, and I think that these identity reversals are about the unconscious. The fact that your conscious identity is actually not like your conscious identity, pop Freudianism uses the iceberg model. I looked through Freud's papers. He never uses the iceberg model, but he has a topography.
Yeah.
And whatever the topography, however we read it, of the mind, there's a substantial portion of the mind which is unconscious, which is mean you're not bringing it in your conscious identity. There's something that moves you that is not your, that leads to these weird identity reversals. So I just think the more we're aware about these things, the more we can read through certain identitarian performativities which have these contradictions in them, which allow us to see something deeper.
Yeah, so that leads me to this, there's so much gravity around Fuentes in the digital space.
Yeah.
And these kind of at the edges of political and religious thought, because he's this and the Christian nationalism in the West. And so when he says things like in his response to Charlie Kirk's death, like, I'm a Catholic, I believe in the gospel, it was wrong, we shouldn't treat people like, he does this whole Christian plea in his response to Charlie Kirk's death. And then and you're talking performative contradictions, and then the next thing you know, he's just like saying the worst
Jews.
Yeah, he's saying that, or about the vice president's wife and whoever else, like, and you're just like, whoa, like, and it's because we're confused on where to place these, like you're saying, like we've been talking about, like where to place these identities, and how these identities speak across these liminal and these boundaries that are these hierarchies that are, I think, are real, and but it's so fraught. It's still fraught in trying to have.
I think the cross with Fuentes is clearly on the level of women.
Yeah.
Like when you hear him talk about it, me and my wife were listening to this clip where Fuentes is like, he's in a super chat and someone's asking about when he's going to get married. And he's like racking his head. He's like, oh God, like maybe I'm going to grow up in 3 years and 30, I'm going to get a wife. But he said, the problem with getting a wife though, then she's in my bed. Then she's asking me weird questions at breakfast. And, why won't she shut up? Like, it's like, but it's like clearly there's something there which needs to be dealt with before we get into the big political national program discussions, like, it's like, let's deal with these, that, back to the fractal that you were outlining. You have the person, then you have the marriage, then the household. It's like, you got to get this in the right order, right? Because if you don't get this in the right, like, that's my whole thing, is like, if you don't do the person, then the marriage, then the household, then the tribe, then the nation, and so forth, then it's kind of like what I was talking about with the shooting of the pistol from reason to absolute knowing. It's like, if you don't get it in the right order, then you're going to mess everything up. And, that's why all this is so important. But I'll bring that back to like what I was saying about the fractal in the phenomenology of spirit. I think that right now, I really feel like we're still at the tail end of the Peterson moment, which I link to religion.
Yeah.
Which I think is what you see downstream of Peterson, is the guys downstream of Peterson, they become even more religious than Peterson. And then they're upset that Peterson won't identify as a Christian.
Yeah.
And I think really what we need to break into is the domain of what I call absolute knowing, which is this kind of disorienting, topsy-turvy space where left becomes right and right becomes left, and sacred becomes profane and profane becomes sacred, and science becomes religion and religion becomes and all this stuff, like, it's crazy.
Man, I could almost like give examples for every one of those in a way. It seems like, because of how we're in this moment where all that's changing.
Yeah.
That's so fascinating. Dude, Cadell, man, this has been a wonderful conversation, and I'm excited to share it with everyone. And getting to continue a conversation with you that we started, over a year ago now, and where things are going in the last few minutes here. Point people to your book or the people that you think your book would really benefit, and then also talk about Philosophy Portal.
Well, the book Real Speculations is a work which is for people. I don't have a word like the TLC, but so there's this little corner. There's the liminal web, which is like a cultural progressive space. There's underground theory scene, which is like para-academic, people doing theory and academics, but not in the university. So there's all these overlapping online digital networks, and Real Speculations is for these people. Real Speculations are for people who are who are kind of disillusioned by the institutions. It's for people who are trying to do something in a different way, some weird mix between the digital and the physical, the local and the global. And I'm basically offering a philosophical lens, but not only a philosophical lens, also kind of like a engaged pragmatism with how to it's philosophy, but it's also building Philosophy Portal and interacting with all these different organizations and spaces online, and how do we do this kind of thing professionally. And that's why I take an interest in TLC, your work. What I appreciate about your work is that you're someone who's actively cultivating a conversation space online and trying to raise the discourse in a way that's not algorithmically mediated, but not also ignorant of the algorithm. There's these paradoxes of how much do I satisfy the algorithm versus how much do I keep this person-centric, people-centric? And we're dealing with all these things. So that's so Real Speculations is a philosophical angle on all these things. And you'll get kind of a good history of Philosophy Portal through this book. The background of Philosophy Portal is that I wanted to teach the deepest philosophy. I couldn't feel like I could do it in the universities. And so literally Philosophy Portal emerged from my inability to teach real philosophy at the universities. And I just started, I'm just going to do it online. I really think the reason why Hegel is the foundation of Philosophy Portal is because I think he's the philosopher of modernity in the same way that Plato is the philosopher of the ancient world, in my view. And that we need to sublate modernity. That we can't go back. I understand there's a temptation to go back, but I just feel like it's an impossibility. I feel like we have to think the contradictions of our moment. We have to lift modernity. And so Philosophy Portal is trying to participate in that direction. Its courses, its work is organized in that direction. And then, of course, we have the portal, which is the community space at Philosophy Portal, where you were also a participant for a month. And we host these monthly mini courses where we bring on different people from either the liminal web or the TLC or the underground theory scene. And we're trying to build in philosophy and culture and religion with people's active projects. And so I'm super excited. This December, we're going to have a kind of year in review month at the portal, of which you'll be a part of an event related to Christianity and transition, kind of reviewing both the month and where we're at with that process of Christianity and transition. And just my focus now, I'm probably the biggest part of my life is I've just become a father. And the next few months, I'm just going to be thinking about how to sublate fatherhood into this project and how to keep things going while also juggling new family dynamics and professional, personal dynamics. That's me.
Awesome, Cadell. Well, thank you so much. And if you're listening out there, check out Philosophy Portal YouTube website. Check out Real Speculations. Will be linked below. All right, man. Thank you so much.
Peace out.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for sticking around till the end. If you really liked that conversation, I encourage you to check out this video recommended to you. And if you want to see some more of my conversations on a playlist featured in this corner of the internet, check this one out. And if you want to follow along on the podcast, click here, right here. And don't forget to subscribe over here. Leave a comment.